Today, it's all about flowers. We talk about the origin and evolution of flowers and some of the strategies and trade-offs that they use in order to adapt to their environment, including some of their defense mechanisms that they use, as well as some of their strategies for attracting pollinators, like why they are certain colors. Then we have a nice discussion on environmentalism and some of the issues related to that, including climate change and invasive species and how that affects some of the local ecologies of flowers. If you would, talk a little bit about your expertise.
So, hi, I'm Pam Soltis. I'm a curator and professor at the Florida Museum of Natural History at the University of Florida. And my research expertise is in plant evolutionary biology. So, I started out being particularly interested in the process of speciation. So, how do new species arise? What are the processes involved? What are the genetic consequences of different types of species formation? And that led me into really thinking a lot about fields such as hybridization and polyploidy, which is the basically genome duplication process. And those sorts of questions have stayed with me over the course of the last, 40 years or so. But there are a number of other things that have also taken, sort of a major place in my research program. And one of these has to do with how plant groups are related to each other. And this goes back to a very formative moment in when I was in graduate school. We read a paper. I even still remember this paper. This is probably the fall of 1983. We read this paper in this one discussion class, a seminar class, and it was about the genetic divergence between these two species of some sort of insect. I'm thinking they were like walking sticks or something, but I can't remember for sure. But one of the criticisms that one of my classmates made was, well, this is an interesting paper, but how can we talk about speciation between these two things if we don't actually know how they're related? And I remembered saying, well, the authors say that these are closely related. And this other classmate kept saying, but there's not a phylogenetic tree, or an evolutionary tree showing relationships. Nobody has done that for this group of species. So if we don't really know that things are closest relatives, how can we actually study speciation? And that just like totally changed my perspective on everything. So I added a phylogenetic analysis or family tree sort of analysis to my dissertation. And I did that for the group of plants that I was studying at the time. And subsequently, that's like snowballed, and we've been spending a big chunk of our research time and expertise over the last several decades trying to figure out how different plant groups are related to each other. So, and then that really can just provide a framework for understanding anything that you want to know about plants. Like, how did this character arise? Well, you go back and you look at your tree and you say, okay, given this family tree, it must have originated here, it diversified there, and all of that sort of thing. So it's like using, a human family tree to understand where your traits came from. So most of my work has been sort of focused on the concepts of speciation and family trees and how we can put some of those things together to understand how new species originate, how they diversify, where they go, how they coexist, all of those sorts of things. But there's this sort of family tree framework behind all of it.
Mhm. And I imagine your field has changed quite a bit with the new tools, the genetic tools that we have. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. Yeah, the
Mhm.
genetic tools that have originated. I mean, sequencing was a dream back when I was a graduate student, and now it's like routine. And the other thing that has changed dramatically is computational abilities. So the sorts of computational power that we have now, couldn't even imagine. We used to run these certain family tree reconstructions on our, old Apple Macintoshes, and you would set it up and you'd put a sign on it that says, please do not turn this off, and it might run for months in order to
Oh,
get
wow.
through. But the software was only written for those old Macs, and now of course we can run it on you know supercomputers and all of that sort of stuff. So things have changed dramatically.
the reason, sort of the hook that I thought of for why I wanted to talk to you to begin with was, I guess something sort of obvious that everyone knows, that flowers are meant to attract pollinators, and that's sort of their function. But it kind of struck me that that's actually quite an odd thing in nature. Most things they're trying to hide from predators, they don't want to be seen, but flowers advertise themselves with all colors and shapes, but they also smell and they do all these things, and they really want to attract attention. So I thought that was kind of just an interesting way to jump things off.
Yeah, no, I think that's fascinating. I mean, flowers are really amazing. And as you say, most organisms don't advertise themselves. If they do advertise themselves, it's to make themselves look like something else, right? So that they make themselves look like something that's deadly so that they can escape predation that way. So flowers are really unusual. They're also really unusual even among all plant groups, because other groups of plants that don't produce flowers, like our, conifers and, other gymnosperms and our ferns and things, also don't have particularly flashy reproduction, and they don't generally involve the activities of other organisms. I mean, it is true that some cycads are beetle pollinated and benefit from certain insects, but most other plant groups do not have this sort of relationship with pollinators. And so, it's pretty spectacular when you think about the fact that, we've had land plants for, let's say 450 million years, and it's not until the last maybe 150 million years or so that there were flowers, and the number of flowering plant species is so much greater than all the rest of the plant species combined. So certainly over this, shorter time span of the last 120, 130, 150 maybe million years, the flower has definitely conferred advantages that have allowed for this crazy amount of diversification that has allowed all these species to originate and to spread.
Yeah, so let's go from there then. So flowers, so you just said that they're a very powerful tool that plants have, and it's for sexual reproduction. So I guess that would be my first question is, what's the benefit of plants that reproduce sexually, and then why are flowers such a powerful tool in doing that?
Sexual reproduction is really important for long-term adaptation and evolutionary longevity, we might say. There's been a lot of theoretical work for decades about the so-called advantages of sex, but there are also disadvantages. So it's expensive to go to all of this trouble to have separate sexes in terms of organs and processes and everything. And this is true whether it's a plant or an animal. And over the short term, asexual reproduction could be beneficial. So if an individual genotype is perfectly suited to its environment, it's great if there's just asexual reproduction. It's cheaper, it's faster, and it provides, that sort of good linkage between environment and organism. But in an environment that's changing, and whether that's changing temporally or changing spatially, it's much better in the longer run to have the mixing that takes place when you have sexual reproduction. And so sexual reproduction generates new combinations of genetic variation. And so there could be new combinations that would be better suited to different aspects of the environment. So over the long term, sexual reproduction is generally considered to be favorable. So that's what happens in, most of the animals we're familiar with. That happens in most land plants as well. But it is very costly in terms of flowering plants, especially those that produce these, very showy flowers that produce a lot of either nectar or pollen as rewards. So a lot of resources have to go into that in order to attract the pollinators to want to visit and then to affect pollination in the process. So the benefits must outweigh those costs, or there would be selection against that.
I do want to focus on flowers here for a while. We'll get to the cost benefits in just a bit. I want to talk just super basic. I know most people are familiar with flowers, and I'm sure that they learned about it in biology class in school, but just, get everyone up to speed with like just the features and the function of a flower.
Oh yeah, so flowers are so spectacular because they're all built from the same basic building blocks, and yet different species have modified these different parts in such different ways. So the basic flower consists of sepals on the outside. Those are usually green, and they protect the rest of the flower when the flower is still in bud. So that's our first component. That's the outer part. The next component is the petals, and the petals are typically the showy part, the colored part, and they, are the next in line. And those are largely what provide the attractive feature for the flower in terms of attracting pollinators. But they also provide some additional protection for the actual organs that produce the gametes, which are in the center of the flower when the flower is still in bud. So once the flower opens, the sepals are on the outside, the petals are next. And then the third component would be the stamens. And the stamens consist generally of two parts. There's a stem of a stamen, which is a little stalk called a filament. And then at the tip is the anther, and it's the anther where the pollen is produced. And that pollen can take all sorts of different forms. There can be different amounts and everything. But ultimately, what that pollen will produce after a little bit more development, the pollen will produce the sperm cells, which are important for ultimately having fertilization. So we've got the sepals, the petals, the stamens, and then in the center of the flower is the carpel, and the carpel is a single unit. Sometimes there are multiple carpels that are fused together, and then that is often referred to as the pistil. So some people, learn the fourth sort of central component as being a pistil, and that's totally fine. It's just that the pistil is often formed from, multiple carpels. So I like to think of the actual component parts of that carpel. But the carpel has as its base, it has the ovary, and it's in the ovary where the ovules are produced. And we'll come back to ovules in just a second. And then there's sort of a stalk above the ovary, and that's just an elongated portion of the carpel or pistil. And then at the tip is the stigma, and the stigma is the sticky surface where the pollen will be deposited. And whether that pollen is deposited by wind or by a pollinator, that may vary among species, but it's that sticky surface of the stigma where the pollen is trapped. So what happens after pollination is that pollen will land on the stigma, and then it germinates and it grows down through the style, which is that elongated part of the carpel, all the way down to the ovary at the base. And within the ovary are these structures called ovules. And it is the ovule that will ultimately produce the egg. So we've got this pollen grain germinating down through the style. It enters the ovary, and there's, depending on the species, some cell divisions that take place. And that pollen grain will produce usually two sperm cells. And those sperm cells then have specific roles once they get inside the ovary. And this is so amazing. It's just like, where did this come from, right? So within the ovule, which is in the ovary, there is an egg cell, and then there are a few other cells. And depending on the species, there might be a total of 7 cells, or there might be a total of 5 cells, varies a little bit. The typical number is 7 cells. So one of those cells is the egg, and one sperm cell unites with that. And that makes the zygote, which will develop into the embryo and the next plant. But that second sperm cell is not wasted. In fact, it has a very, very important function. It will unite with the 2 nuclei in the center of the ovule. So this ovule, remember, let's say in this example, it has 7 cells. The middle cell actually has 2 nuclei. So the second sperm unites with those 2, and that forms a really important tissue called endosperm. And it produces the nutrition for that developing embryo. So you end up with, after fertilization takes place, you have a zygote, which will become the embryo in the next generation of the plant. And then you have this endosperm tissue. So when we think about a flower, we tend to think of this as being this showy, amazing, sometimes really highly specialized structure. Its role is to attract the pollinators and everything, but it's so highly functional. So all of this is has been selected in such a way that it's not just attracting the pollinators, but once it gets that pollen, then this whole process of what we call double fertilization, because there are two fusion events that take place, all of that takes place right there in the center of the flower. Just these amazing fine tuning of these different processes that will yield ultimately a fruit. The ovary will ripen into a fruit and the ovule will develop into a seed, all right there in the center of that carpel, in the center of the flower, inside the stamens and the petals and the sepals.
Mhm. And then does that happen multiple times for each flower, or that happens once?
So usually within a single flower, there will be probably a single, this is a little variable, but probably a single episode of like what I just described. But some flowers may have multiple carpels or a multi-parted pistil, so that the same process might happen multiple times in these different carpels in the center of the flower. And then and sometimes there might be, there could be lots of ovules within a single carpel. So you could have a lot of these events actually taking place. So you could get a lot of seeds produced within a single fruit. You can sometimes get multiple fruits produced from sort of within a single flower. And then of course, as you have multiple flowers, it's happening all across a single plant.
Mhm. Then I read there's sexual dimorphism in some flowers as well, so they actually have different features. Is that right?
Yeah, so the way that plant species actually put these different component parts together into flowers is highly variable. So sometimes, all four of those structures, the sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels are present in a single flower. That's the typical situation. But sometimes maybe the petals are missing, and maybe for a wind pollinated plant, they've lost their petals. But sometimes you also could have unisexual flowers. And sometimes those two different flowers look alike, except for just not having one of the sexual reproductive structures or the other. But sometimes they can also appear differently. And sometimes that's related to pollination as well. So there might be a flower that, like there are some orchid species that mimic insects, mainly bees and wasps, I guess. And they will produce scents that will mimic the pheromones of the pollinator. And so, a bee or a wasp will fly into this flower, and a male will, and try to mate with the flower. And in the process, it does very effective pollination. There's not always the sexual dimorphism of the flowers associated with that, but it's definitely related to the reproductive systems.
Mhm. You said something before. You were amazed at just the complex structure and how functional the flowers are. And I was wondering, do we have that evolutionary story of like how flowers sort of came to be?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So when considering the fossil record of the flowering plants, Darwin referred to their origin and early diversification as an abominable mystery. And we still are not very clear on how this structure of the flower originated and became like so quickly entrenched in the whole lineage that became the flowering plants. I think the fossil evidence best tells us that the first flowers, they had these same basic parts, but they were very small. They were maybe potentially insect pollinated, but maybe wind pollinated. There are some fossils that suggest sort of maybe a transition from being a gymnosperm with naked ovules to something that was, sort of a flower where there is the reproductive structure, but with like a little called a cupule around it. But we still really don't understand that. What we do know is that by 125 million years ago, there were the most common big group of flowering plants today, our group known as the eudicots, so EU dicots, the true dicots, in other words.
Hmm.
They were everywhere around the world. We have fossil pollen that corresponds to the eudicots. almost everywhere in the world at 125 million years ago. So for some reason, they were able to spread, the plants were able to spread really rapidly. And we have the history of that in the fossil record through pollen. But at that point, even those fossils have very indistinct sorts of flowers. So they must have started out somehow like that. But then by, let's say, 110 million years ago, we have a lot of groups of plants that we would recognize today as like, oh, that's a magnolia. That's something in the, in the avocado family. So there were a lot of things that were actually sort of obvious very quickly after those other things originated. So we don't really know how they got started. There's some interesting work about some of the genes that control some of these organs. And through comparisons of those genes with non-flowering plants, we can see that those genes were active in the non-flowering plants, but they didn't produce those structures. So we know some of the genetics behind the structures of the flowers, but we don't know what the signals are that basically, led to the evolutionary switch.
Okay. Yeah, we'll go back to the trade-offs and sort of the how you build a flower and what are all the pressures that the plant, kind of has to consider, I guess, when it's building a flower in terms of their environment, their predators, whatever else.
Yeah, so we recognize what a lot of the adaptations of flower parts might be in terms of their attractiveness, their protection, their promotion of wind pollination versus insect pollination. So there are a lot of things like that that seem like obvious adaptations, but a lot of those things are very expensive to produce. So it takes a lot of energy to produce a lot of nectar to attract a certain type of pollinator. It takes a lot of energy to produce the pollen for a pollen collecting pollinator. And even for wind pollinated species, like a lot of grasses, they produce tons and tons of pollen because that pollen is just going out into the environment with no specified place for it to land. And so it's like totally chance that it's going to land on female parts of another flower. So there are huge investments that flowering plants make in order to assure that there is reproduction through these methods. But it must be beneficial or none of this would be taking place. So what might be the benefits? Well, one benefit is certainly the benefit of sexual reproduction, which can contribute to enhanced opportunities for adaptation to different environments. So for a widespread species, it might be beneficial to be able to generate different combinations that would be adaptive in different environments. Also in environments that change a lot, either spatially or temporally, having these different combinations could be really beneficial. And, for the most part, we don't necessarily know what the conditions are that led originally to the origins of particular floral structures. But we can hypothesize after the fact, oh, maybe this was an advantage for that. A lot of times we can't actually do the test. And so the testing comes through different types of mathematical modeling and through simulation. So you could say, okay, what happens if you invest this amount of resources in a flower, but you only get this much benefit? What's going to happen on the long term or something like that? So you can investigate some of these sorts of things from a theoretical standpoint, because we can't go, unfortunately, we don't really have the right time machines to go back and see what things were like at the point of origin.
I guess just the colors is an interesting feature to key in on. Why are there so many different colors?
Yeah, the colors that plants produce are amazing. And then, I think it's always kind of fun, but also important to think about what the colors are as we see them versus the colors that potential pollinators see them as. A lot of animals, don't see colors, or they only see certain colors, or they see colors in a certain range. They don't necessarily see what we're seeing. So for a lot of plants that are, we might look at them and we see blue. it's the underlying pigments that matter to the pollinators are not the blue pigments that we see, but instead they might be the yellow pigments that underlie the blues that are there. You know, some people working on certain types of pollination biology will actually photograph flowers under ultraviolet light or under different types of light in order to get a better handle on the what different potential pollinators might be seeing. And a lot of times even we might look at a flower and we might see on the petal that it's just yellow, but a pollinator might actually see these little stripes that are there because there are stripes in the other compounds, things that we don't see, but that are obvious to the pollinators. And they're like little landing strips that sort of guide the pollinators in toward the center of the flower. So there's a lot, I keep saying this, I guess there's a lot we don't know about flower pigments. I mean, we do know that there are a couple of broad classes of pigments that flowering plants produce. So the main category that plants use for things like reds and blue pigments, those are called anthocyanins. And they're a very widespread category of compound. They're related to some of the secondary defense compounds that a lot of plants make. And there are small deviations in those flowers, or in those chemicals will yield blue versus pink versus, red or purple sorts of flowers. There's another broad category called betalins, and those are all restricted to one particular group of plants, but they're also highly diverse. But they produce the same colors as the anthocyanins, reds, blues, pinks, and purples. And things like the cacti have produced that particular class of compounds. And then there are compounds that are in the yellow, that are various shades of yellow that are often produced as, what we could kind of think of them as background color because they're produced even when there are these pinks and blues and reds that are produced. But we don't see them unless there's a mutation and the red colors doesn't get produced. So there's a lot of chemistry that goes into also into building flowers in terms of their color. Certain pollinators that are then, of course, attracted to different colors. So we think of hummingbirds as being attracted to generally red, not always, but generally red tubular flowers. A lot of bees will visit blue or white or sometimes even yellow flowers. And then hawk moths will visit typically white flowers and white flowers that are open at night. And the hawk moths will visit for nectar. There are a lot of these syndromes that don't hold up 100%, but that are general categories of pollination. So certain flower colors and shapes might attract a certain pollinator. And that's always a good hypothesis then for what the pollinators might be, because in most cases, we don't actually know what the real pollinators are.
Okay. That feeds well into my next question. I was wondering why flowers would select for specific pollinators. To my thoughts, it would just be the more the merrier, the more things you can get in here. The famous case is the Darwin flower, right? The flower that's he hypothesized there must be this animal because it needs to be pollinated by something with a very specific tool to get into the flower. And
Right.
it just seemed weird to me that a flower would adapt these features to exclude everything but like one pollinator. So
Yeah, no, really. So, I mean, I guess some of this is sort of just reflects that natural selection doesn't always follow what we think might be the best strategy, right? So, I would say there are generally multiple ways to solve a problem. So the problem is assurance of pollination and reproduction. There can be selection on a number of different ways of going about that. So one strategy that some plants have is to be generalists, and they actually don't care who their pollinators are as long as it's something. They'll produce a flower that's very open, that has, moderate amount of pollen or nectar and stuff. And you might then get a bunch of different things, like a bunch of different types of maybe bees, maybe some flies and things. And so through having this generalist strategy, you tend to maximize your pollination likelihood. But then there are other species, as you mentioned, that have this one-on-one relationship with a pollinator, and that might work super well under certain conditions, because that pollinator is only going to visit that plant. And that means that, okay, you know that there will be visits, but if something happens to that pollinator, then there could be some serious repercussions for the plant, and vice versa. And actually, it's interesting because this is something that we're seeing right now with climate change, is that plants and their pollinators are not always responding in the same way to changing temperatures. So some plants are flowering earlier and flowering longer than they did previously. We have lots and lots of data to support that. And some pollinators are emerging at different times because of changes in temperature in particular. And so what's happening is that plants and their pollinators are not always in sync with each other anymore. And so there are a lot of pollinators that don't have the plants that they're adapted to feeding on as food sources. And there are a lot of plants that don't have the pollinators that they're adapted for actually doing the pollination. And so there's a lot of concern, I would say probably more among insect biologists, about this pollinator mismatch that seems to be arising. Maybe more concern from that side than from the plant side, because often a lot of plants will have a backup system, which is self-fertilization. That if the pollination between plants doesn't work, a lot of them have a backup.
Hmm. I want to talk a little bit about the defense mechanisms that flowers have too. They have some physical defenses, but also some chemical defenses. And yeah, so tons of drugs, right, are made out of flowers, and a lot of those are chemical defenses or used somehow. So yeah, we can talk about both of those.
Yeah. So flowering plants are amazing factories of chemistry, and a lot of that chemistry can be harnessed for human use and has been, but there's so much more that we don't know that could also be put to human benefit. It's one of the arguments that people often make for why it's so important to conserve species worldwide. I mean, it's not just true of plants. Fungi provide a lot of the same sorts of potential benefits, and we know even less about fungi than we do about flowering plants. But certainly the potential for drugs is something that a lot of people will argue for why we need to be much better stewards of the plants on our planet. But those plants are not making those compounds for us as potential cancer treatments or whatever the possible use might be. They're using them in defense, and they're using them to deter herbivores. And interestingly, sometimes pollinators are also herbivores, and so there are often very interesting relationships there as well, that a plant might be signaling to a species to come pollinate it, but the leaves might actually not be, well, they might be toxic to that pollinator. So there can be some really interesting things going on there. But in general, the types of compounds that plants make, there's a huge range, like lots of different categories of chemistry that plants use in defense. And then there are some compounds that it's not really clear what the plants are doing with them. They're often referred to as secondary chemistry. They're not particularly toxic to insects or other animals, but they don't seem to have special roles in primary plant metabolism either. So it's kind of thought that together, maybe they just form this toxic cocktail that pooled together with some of the other more potent compounds. But then, of course, there are this types of physical defense mechanisms as well. So some plants invest in thorns or spines or hairs or other sorts of structures that make it really difficult for an animal to chew on them. Then there's always sort of this arms race between herbivores and plants.
So are they mostly geared towards insects, or like these bigger animals that, like, I don't know.
Yeah, so a lot of the chemistry, I think, is probably focused on insect herbivores or maybe very other, maybe small mammals or something. But a lot of those bigger armaments have evolved as deterrents for large vertebrates. So I know of some work that some colleagues have done in Africa on, some of the big thorns and some of the other, large structures as deterrents for, against elephants or giraffes, chewing on these specific trees in parts of Africa. So some of them are, yeah, definitely aimed at very small scale herbivores and others at much larger ones.
And fungus too, right? A lot of the chemicals.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So there are, certain types of compounds that plants will produce that will confer resistance to fungi or bacteria.
And then I wondered too, most of the drugs are like insecticides or somehow they're meant to deter, but do they use drugs at all as a method of attracting animals?
Yeah, so I mean, there's some really unusual things that different plant groups will do. So there are certain plants that actually provide homes for types of fungi, and then the fungi will then provide some defense against other
Mhm.
potential either pathogens or pests. And so sometimes you can see these very complicated sets of, you can almost think of them as being social interactions, even though they're involving organisms that do not really have sociality. It can get like really sort of complicated. And those are highly unusual situations, but super interesting when they're discovered. And there are probably many more of those sorts of things that we're just not really aware of. But do they actually produce, I mean, but what are the signals? I mean, we don't necessarily even know that, but yeah. I mean, other than the fragrances, of course, that the flowers will produce, then those, of course, are attracting other organisms. So yeah, the flowers will produce a lot of different sorts of compounds.
Mhm. Yeah, I was just wondering that because so many of the recreational as well as medicinal drugs that we use come from flowers. I was just wondering if, animal pollinators, if they try to attract them, give them a dopamine hit of cocaine or something that they would like and come back to, not just the food and, the
Yeah,
normal
that's really
incentives.
interesting. I don't know if anybody has investigated that, but
Okay.
certainly the fact that they're plants that naturally produce those compounds, what are the effects? Are there effects on the herbivores or the pollinators? Yeah, so that's a really interesting question.
Okay. Let's move on to the seeds then, and how the transformation from the pollinated flower. You talked a little bit about the pollination or the fertilization process, but then there's a whole other process of creating the seeds, building up the structure of the seeds, and getting those out into the world to create new plants, right? So there's a
Yeah.
lot of features there that are important and are interesting, I guess.
Yeah, so we always tell our classes that if you want to understand the seed, you have to understand the ovule. And so when we were talking about the structure of the flower before, I referred to the ovule as being this very special structure that is also found in other seed plants, not just flowering plants, but it's responsible for what will become the seed. So we have this amazing transformation of the egg being fertilized by one sperm cell to form the zygote, and these two other nuclei being fertilized by a second sperm cell to form the endosperm. And once those two fertilization events take place, and we call this double fertilization, once those two events take place, then the outer sort of covering of the ovule begins to be transformed into a harder structure, and that will become the seed coat. And so you have these layers of protection around the ovule. Even though the ovule is down inside the ovary, you have these layers of protection around the ovule that eventually then will harden and become the seed coat. Now, at the same time as that's happening, the zygote is developing into a little embryo. and it's getting to the point where it will be able to eventually be shed from that parent plant and go out and be able to germinate. At the same time, that endosperm tissue is rapidly dividing and making the food for the embryo that's developing. And so you have this little embryo growing within the ovule, which is the developing seed, and you have that endosperm nourishing that. And so then eventually, like toward the ripening phase, you've got eventually the mature seed, which is housed within the ovary wall. And within that ovary is also undergoing transformation. So the ovary will become the fruit, and depending on what type of fruit, that may develop a hard outer casing as well. It may become a fleshy fruit. There are all these different sorts of fruits. We can think about our things that we consider fruits, but we can also think about things like tomatoes, which are fruits, botanically, even though we might not refer to them as a fruit. So we have all of these different sorts of fruits that are basically the vessels that the seeds are located in. And then those fruits can either be dispersed by the environment, they may be dispersed by animals, and they'll go out into the environment. The fruits will either pass through an animal's gut, or they may just open and disperse the seeds. They might just decompose and leaving the seeds, and then the seeds will, under the right conditions, then will germinate and form the next generation of the plant itself.
Mm.
So all pretty
So,
amazing processes.
yeah, I'd like to get into some of those there. So most seeds have a hard shell there is to protect it, but you still somehow need to get a signal in there to tell it to germinate, right? So it's usually water, I suppose, but also like somehow there's some photosensitive stuff in there as well. Yeah, so that's kind of interesting just to begin with, because you want to protect it, and seeds they almost seem kind of inert for a long time until they get activated,
Yeah,
right?
right. Yes. And of course, depending on the environment, the type of habitat where the seed occurs, where the plant occurs, there will be different signals that will sort of tell the seed when it's okay to germinate. But sometimes, it's a combination of things. So seeds from certain environments, more northern habitats, often need to undergo what's referred to as vernalization, just meaning they need to go through a cold treatment that, even if they're produced in the summer, they can't germinate until the following spring. I suppose that's an adaptation for germinating too soon and getting stuck as little seedlings,
Mm,
in a cold winter.
mm,
So a lot of plants will, need to have a combination of water, temperature, and maybe just some built-in, what's sometimes referred to as an after ripening period, that it may take a combination of time and temperature and water before you can actually have germination take place. Others, yeah, they might need the warmth of sun actually hitting them. Other seeds, like basically as soon as they're shed, if they've got water, they can germinate. So there are a lot of different types of signals that different species would receive that would lead to germination. And yet we have some species where there are huge seed banks. There might be seeds that are in the soil for years, maybe even decades, without germinating. And that if brought out of the soil and given the right treatment, they might still germinate, even though other seeds produced by that, like at the same time, maybe have already germinated. And so, but then there are other species that don't produce a seed bank, other habitats that don't produce seed banks. So there's a bucket of soil could tell you about what used to be there,
mm,
because there could be a lot of seeds in there.
mm. So it has that shell, and then it also has just a lot of energy stored in that seed, right? Because it needs to kick off the process of growing the plant with some transformable form of energy, and that's why so much of our food, I suppose, is seeds. But I don't think most plants they don't want their seeds to be eaten. They don't want that energy to go into other animals, right? They want to use that for themselves. So yeah, I guess could you talk about how they use it, and then like also their defenses for being eaten? Because I know there's a lot of chemicals packed into seeds.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so it is interesting that for certain species, the seed will have at maturity, it will still have some have endosperm, sort of as a way of, continuing to maybe provide for the seedling as it starts to grow. But in other species, the energy actually starts to get stored in particular organs of the embryo. So you can think about some species of beans, for example, where they have these very fleshy cotyledons or seed leaves, and those are packed with energy. Sometimes it's stored in the form of oils that can be used to support the early germination phases. There's a lot of diversity also in terms of how that energy is stored and then provisioned to the developing embryo. Okay, so does the plant actually benefit from having its seeds eaten or not? Well, of course, it would be disadvantageous for the embryo to be destroyed in the process. But there are some species where actually part of the signaling that's needed for the seed to be able to germinate is like passing through the gut of an animal, and that provides the maybe breaks in the seed coat that will ultimately allow the embryo to break through. So sometimes there's a combination of chemical and physical weakening that an animal's gut will provide so that when the seed comes out the other end, it actually is then receptive to those temperature and moisture conditions so that it can germinate, and that it will not germinate if it doesn't have that treatment. So it's just another example of sometimes these really tight associations between plants and animals in this case, or other organisms. Some plants do produce within their seeds a number of compounds that could be toxic to potential herbivores as well, like seed-eating animals, and, things that even that we would want to eat. And so it's important to have some of those chemicals leached out prior to our use of them, but they could end up deterring the, other sorts of herbivores from eating them.
Yeah, let's move on to food a little bit. For us, our sort of agricultural industry is largely based around flowering plants, of course. You talked about grains, I guess they have sort of a different process going on, but most of the things you see in the grocery store, at least in the produce section, they have flowers. I don't know if there's actually a question there. Just to note the importance of the flowering plants to us, and the issues around pollination and climate change and all that kind of stuff that we're seeing.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that I think is really underappreciated is how much of our food comes from flowering plants, and even beyond the plants themselves that we eat, the feed that is provided to chickens and livestock, and also composed mostly of materials from flowering plants. And so the flowering plants are providing the food directly and indirectly that we eat. The other thing that's really amazing about flowering plants is that, our main food globally, comes from just a few crops. So rice and corn and wheat provide the staples for a lot of our agriculture. And of course, those are the three main crops. If we go back to the origins of modern civilizations, it was the domestication of the wild relatives of those three crops that led to developments of our societies, in Asia, India, the Middle East, and Central and South America. And so there's also, in addition to the really important aspects of these three crops, there's the whole foundation of modern civilization that traces back to these domestication events. But really, I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's maybe around only like 30 different plants that that provide most of our crops. I mean, and then there's maybe like another 35 or so that are interesting foods, but not used that much. And that's like, so maybe let's say 70 species out of
Hmm.
almost 400,000 species of flowering plants provide us with almost all of our food. And that means that there must be a lot of other things out there that have not been tested. We've got great potential sources of like undiscovered in terms of, our culture, in terms of food, that where probably local peoples in different parts of the world have made use of different foods. Non-traditional agriculture seems like there's a huge potential there for helping with food security.
I mean, obviously, a lot of the food is things that we've cultivated to be that way, but I suppose there's definitely more opportunities, especially because we can do it a lot faster with genetic modification and stuff. There's all kinds of things. And I want to talk a little bit about some environmentalism and some issues surrounding that as well. You talked earlier about the importance of genetic diversity in flowers for potential drugs and things like that, and food, as we just said. So yeah, I guess that's the first place to start, is just to talk about the genetic diversity of plants. And
Yeah, so there are an estimated 350 to 400,000 species of flowering plants. We don't exactly know the total number, but just in terms of species that have been named and described scientifically, it's somewhere in that 350,000 plus probably range. That's a huge number of species. For comparison, there are about 11,000 species of birds, 6,500 species of mammals, maybe 30,000 species of fishes, so that there are like 65,000 species of vertebrates total. And here are, 350,000 or more species of flowering plants. And these flowering plants are forming the baseline, the framework for the habitats that our animal life and basically inhabits, right? So whether it's rainforest or desert or temperate forest or grassland, it's, the foundation and the major composition is flowering plants. And so perturbations to that species diversity can be very upsetting to those communities. So, we refer to the biodiversity crisis, which is the ongoing rapid loss of species. I mean, the estimated number of flowering plant species that may be lost by the end of the century is staggering. And I won't mention the number because I'll probably get it wrong, but it's always bigger than what I can imagine. I mean, it's maybe, no, I won't say, but a huge fraction. And so if we try to imagine our ecosystems without those estimated numbers of plant species, then there will be, some pretty dramatic repercussions. And of course, there's that sort of disruption to the ecosystems and to all of the other organisms that depend on those habitats. But there is also the potential loss of medicinal value through plants that produce secondary compounds or defense compounds that could be important for human health. There are also many crop wild relatives. So for every crop plant that has been domesticated, there's some set of species that form the closest relatives of those crops from which the crops were actually domesticated. And sometimes there might be 5 to 10 of these crop wild relatives. Well, in some cases, we don't know what properties those wild relatives have that could be beneficial for crop improvement, either in yield or resistance to disease or whatever for moving into the future and dealing with problems of food security. But we also have the potential to lose those crop wild relatives before we even, could study them, meaning that we would lose that ability to incorporate any of their beneficial traits into our agricultural products. So the fact that there is so much amazing diversity out there about which we know so little and of which so much is rapidly going extinct is, just a very sobering thought on so many levels. We see the potential for losses of our ecosystems and losses for potential benefits for humankind as well.
do we know the primary drivers of those losses? Just the ones that come to mind for me is climate change, of course, is the big one that everyone's concerned about, but also just like habitat destruction, I assume is also a big one. And then I was also curious about invasive species, because I know that's a big issue.
Yeah, you're totally right. There was a study that was issued in 2019 by it's an intergovernmental panel on biodiversity and ecosystem services that was convened by the UN. And they published a report that year on the main drivers of essentially of loss of biodiversity and the services that healthy ecosystems provide. And they identified five different things, and they were changes in land use, habitat destruction, climate change, which interestingly was not the number one factor at that point in time, invasive species and overharvesting.
Mm.
And these didn't apply necessarily only to plants, but to species in general. And so
Oh.
those were those I think that was the list that was presented. And then in 2021, there was an updated report that was, sort of emphasized that same thing. But yes, the roles of invasive species in driving other species to extinction. I mean, I see this literally across the street from where I'm sitting right now. We have a conservation area on our campus, and there are some bay trees that are, related to avocado, et cetera. And there was a fungus a beetle that carries a fungus that was introduced from Asia into the southeastern US not that long ago, and it spread, and it kills these trees. And so we have, dead young trees, a few living ones, but also some dead ones just right across the street from us. And
Mhm.
you can see and that was the result of, an invasive beetle coming into the US from Asia and carrying its little fungus that lives in its gut. And the fungus is then wreaking havoc on all of our native trees in the avocado family, and potentially will have similar effects on the avocado industry if it gets into them. So the invasive species actually cost, I think it's somewhere around more than $120 billion per year in damages to either native ecosystems or economically important plants, and other organisms as well. Yeah, every year.
Mhm. So I heard that it's really the rate because these sort of occurrences always happen throughout history. Animals or plants or whatever find a new environment and they just happen to be well adapted for it. And then the environment kind of equilibrates around that. Some new species gets integrated then, but I heard now it's just the rate that's happening. It's just throwing so many things off, and it's causing problems. Where is that right? Where it's just things can't equilibrate fast enough to all the changes.
Yeah, it's
Um,
definitely true. Yeah. So, our global interconnectedness just means that, non-native species are being introduced onto every continent on a daily basis. And despite efforts at quarantine, not everything can be detected. And of course, not everybody, knows, like, well, you don't know what non-native species is going to end up having, that sort of invasiveness associated with it. There's a lot of interesting work that's going on where people are trying to predict which species will actually be invasive in under which circumstances. So, for example, a lot of species from Eastern Asia have been introduced into Eastern North America, and they're very similar climates, very similar habitats, and some of the native plant species are actually each other's closest relatives. So, but under these circumstances, what happens when a plant species from Eastern Asia gets into Eastern North America? Can we predict which of those are going to be invasive and which are just going to sort of, okay, I'll germinate and get along fine here, but not necessarily take off as an invasive? It's not really clear what those characteristics are. So some people have predicted if something is similar to, well, Darwin actually addressed this question too. It was his Darwin's conundrum. Are invasive species most likely to be things that are closely related and very similar to things that are already in an area because they could take off? Or will the things actually be more distantly related because things that are too closely related and similar might be more likely to compete? It seems like anything is possible. Like
hmm,
we have, like, invasive species are generally defying prediction at this point,
hmm,
unfortunately.
you see both those. Interesting. Yeah, and I know, like I know some people are somewhat apathetic, sort of survival of the fittest, whatever plants are best suited. Fine, but I always thought it was weird that like we in America we get invasive species from Africa and Asia, but in those places they get invasive species from America that are causing problems. It's like so it's not just like the biggest baddest ones are winning. It's just like just this
Right.
mixing itself is causing
Yeah,
issues.
exactly. It's, something will get introduced to a new location and it doesn't have its native pests. And whether those pests are microbes, like they're bacteria in the soil, or whether they're fungi, or whether they're things that would eat them or whatever, they don't have their native pests. And so they can do better in their novel environment than any of their close relatives do. And that happens exactly as you mentioned. We've been to Europe. I remember hiking in the Pyrenees and looking down and saying, that's from Eastern North America. It's like, along a trail where you tend to see like weedy species, their weedy species are from Eastern North America, whereas our weedy species might be from Europe. So yeah, it's definitely it's a global issue.
Mhm. This is kind of a weird question. Is that eventually going to have sort of a homogenizing effect on the world, do you think? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, interesting and, potentially sad thought, that diversity that we see in any species, in any group of species, as we go around the world is, tied to both the characteristics of that area and also the history of that area. So like, you go to Australia and it's like everything's different from anything you've ever seen before, right? So animals are different, plants are different. But invasive species have come in there and are, have really wreaked havoc with a lot of the native animals, some of their iconic animals, as well as a lot of the plants. And so if what happens is by invasive species action, you end up losing some of the particularly unique elements of the biota, then the biota becomes much more similar everywhere you go. And yeah, you lose that, all of that beautiful diversity.
Mhm. Okay, that's kind of what I thought, but wasn't sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, a little sad.
yeah.
And then with climate change, so I've heard that the Earth has actually gotten greener as things have changed and gotten warmer. So I was wondering if it's beneficial for all plants that already exist here, and then are they moving, migrating, basically they're changing because, climate change, so the climate's changing in different places. And then also, do we see new adaptations as the environment's changing?
Yeah. Yeah. So really, really good questions. So let's start first by considering how plants are responding to a warming environment. So of course, different species are going to respond in different ways, and we can see evidence of species responses just by looking at, well, various sorts of data over the past few decades. I mean, people often, if they've lived in the same place for a while, they might be noticing that certain plants in their gardens don't do as well as they used to. And that things that they didn't used to be able to grow, they're now growing without problem. And so there's a very obvious change in even, let's say, the last 20 to 30 years in terms of what grows well and I'm coming at this from the perspective of the North Temperate region, right? So we see different sorts of responses in different parts of the world. One of the ways that we can actually detect responses of plants to climate change over the last decades to centuries is by looking at current distributions compared to where plant species were collected and made into herbarium specimens. So we have these great institutions called herbaria around the world. There are something like close to 4,000 of them, I think. And they're like museums of plant specimens. So collectors would go out and still do this today, collect a plant specimen, press it with a special type of press, and then put the plant with special glue onto a piece of paper. It's a standardized piece of paper that will persist for a long period of time. And then a label will go on that paper, or on that big sheet of paper. And that label will tell you the species name, where the plant was collected. Ideally, it would give you the latitude and longitude. Now, in the days past, of course, that wasn't possible. But it'll tell you who collected the plant and the date that the plant was collected. And all of that information is now being digitized. And so we have huge databases globally with hundreds of millions of specimens and observations that tell us where organisms occurred at different points in time. So they're somewhere probably around, I don't know, maybe I'll say 70 or 80 million plant specimens that are in these databases. And we can look at the plant specimens for example, in my region in North Central Florida, we can see what occurred here 100 years ago, and we can see whether or not these plants still occur here or not. We can also develop some models of species, of like ideal habitats for species based on where these plants were collected in the past. And we can say, where did those ideal conditions occur now? They might not occur where they were collected. Those ideal habitats are actually shifting a little bit north. And if we actually say, where will the ideal habitat be located in 30 years or 50 years, it's much farther north than where they currently are. And we can do that all on the basis of these observations and specimens that were collected in the past. And so we've been doing that for flowering plants in the state of Florida. And we're finding, unfortunately, that a lot of species will not really have any suitable habitat in even 30 years from now. The conditions will be too hot and too dry based on what they have, what their optimal conditions are. There are other species, though, that are adapted to hot, dry conditions. And when we map out where their ideal habitat is going to be, instead of just this one little strip in the center part of the state, which is where they actually occur now, the ideal habitat is essentially the entire state. So there will be definite winners and definite losers in this sort of climate lottery that's taking place. But what we mostly see is that the ideal habitats are going to be shifting northward. Now, what this also means, this comes back to the question we were talking about before with invasive species and homogenization. What we're also seeing through this modeling work is that there's likely to be a big homogenization of communities as well. So certain things are just going to drop out because they're not going to make it. Other things are going to be like this one that I mentioned that looks like, oh yeah, it could grow anywhere. And whether it can get everywhere, that's another question, but it could be everywhere. And the same thing could be true for some other species. But the sorts of very specific local adaptations and diverse habitats that we have a very highly diverse flora here. It's like patchworks of all of these different habitats, all based on just very small differences in elevation, like literally like this big of a difference in elevation, because it changes the water dynamics. And so whereas in other parts of like North America, you actually have to go up like real elevation to get that sort of difference because of our limestone, very porous soils here. A very small change in elevation can lead to a huge difference in the plant characteristics. So anyway, the bottom line here is that plants have been responding to warming temperatures over the past several decades. And as we project that into the future, it's likely that we will see very dramatic changes just based on the changes in temperature and precipitation.
I guess we use the same categorizations that we use for animals, the endangered and extinct species. Are there efforts, I'm sure there are, to cultivate these in their environments and rebuild them?
Yeah, so fortunately, there are some really good conservation efforts. There are national and international organizations and also local and state and regional organizations that are focusing on developing local species to ensure that they will be able to persist into the future, even if they're already threatened or endangered. So, for example, there's one botanical garden in Central Florida called Bach Tower Garden, and it has a beautiful public garden, but its really important work is on conservation of rare and endangered Florida species. And they do a lot of local cultivation to produce seed that can be then used in restoration efforts. And one of the things that's very interesting about restoration efforts these days, and there's a group of ecologists in South Florida working on this problem, is how do we go about doing restoration? Do we do restoration today for today's climate? Or do we do restoration planning, taking into account what the projections are for climate in the future? So some of these conservation efforts that are involving cultivation of species for restoration efforts are trying to incorporate models of climate change. They're considering at least putting plants into areas where the habitat will be better for them in the future than it even might be today. There are also forestry efforts that are similar to that. So I remember hearing a presentation several years ago from a forestry group in British Columbia, Canada, where they were already at that point planting seedlings for their forestry industry farther north than where they currently do harvesting for any forest work, because they're anticipating that in 30 years or 40 years, when the trees are the size that they might want to harvest them, they won't be doing as well in the areas where they currently are harvesting. And so they're actually planting this for the future. So there are a number of, especially for long-lived things like that, there are a number of efforts where people are trying to take into account generation time and stuff. But there are some plants, and you alluded to this earlier, that may actually be able to respond to a changing climate sufficiently rapidly that they may not undergo the same sorts of threats to their existence that, longer lived species might. There was a study a few years ago of some herbaceous plants that that appear to have very rapid rates of evolution in terms of adaptations to shifting water tolerances or temperature and that sort of thing. And that sort of led some people, at least, to think that, oh, plants will sort it out. But, some plants might sort it out. Those that have rapid generation times where they can complete a life cycle in less than a year, that means that there are opportunities for adaptation that happen, like there might be 30 cycles of that happening, over the next 30 years. For a long-lived tree like the beautiful oaks and sweet gums that I can see out my window, they don't have that luxury. They're where they are right now, and any seeds that they're producing will be, hitting reproductive sometime before that. So there might be a couple of generations. So really no opportunities for adaptation for especially things that we would consider are the basis of our forests. Herbaceous species might make it, but then that also leads to this idea that, our communities won't look anything like what they do now.
Yeah. I had an earlier podcast on is extinction events for animals more specifically. It sounds similar, where the big animals may be more resilient, but they're far slower to adapt to
Yeah,
change.
exactly.
So,
Yeah.
So my mom works at a nature center, and they cultivate native plants and give tons of seeds. They just give them away to tell people to plant native seeds in your gardens. So could you talk about the importance of native plants, both to the environment, things like
Yeah,
that?
definitely. Yeah, so that's been a big push in our local restoration efforts. So using native plants is important for a lot of reasons. One is, just sharing the beauty of your actual local area. A lot of times we don't actually notice like what's around us, right? We think, oh, we need to bring in the exotic tropical things, or of course those are beautiful. And, I'm definitely not opposed to having some, portion of somebody's lawn, as long as they're not invasive, some, more exotic species. But it's really great to use the natives because they generally are going to need less water, which is important in places, lots of places, and probably increasingly so in the future. But maybe more importantly, the native plants will provide food and habitat for local animals and so on as well. So we like to plant a lot of native plants for pollinator purposes at our house. So we have milkweeds, we plant things from in the sunflower family that are native to our area, and we just we have monarch butterflies, we have all sorts of other butterflies and insects flying around all the time. And that's just an amazing thing that, you don't have if you've got, this bunch of tropical exotics or subtropical exotics. So that especially as some of these habitat changes are leading to mismatches in pollinators and plants, it's important to provide as many resources for pollinators as possible. And so I think that's a really important reason for going with native plants in our gardening.
I have a final question. What do you think are the important research topics or questions to answer in your field, and sort of your vision of the future of your field? What do you see?
Oh, that is a big question. I think one of the things that we're starting to see more of in our field, and I certainly hope that more of this happens in the future, is better integration between ecological studies and evolutionary studies. So for a very long time, like plant evolutionary biology sort of happened on one trajectory and plant ecology happened on another trajectory. And, we were all evolutionary biologists and ecologists would maybe be sort of put together. And we would have some sort of, camaraderie there around similar sorts of principles. But the research itself tended to be largely in isolation. And what we see happening more and more of the possibility of bringing together these different fields. And so more and more these family trees for plants are providing framework for studying things about ecology, and the ecological context is providing more of a framework for understanding things about adaptation and evolution. And so this sort of combination of questions I think has been super interesting, and I'm really hoping that that moves forward. But what underlies any of those changes, whether they're ecological or evolutionary, is the genotype. And so bringing in the information we can get from the technologies developed from the Human Genome Project will mean that we can start to understand not just those relationships between ecology and evolution in terms of how things are moving, but we can actually, start getting at the genetic control of the traits and things that are making a difference. So we can understand more about, okay, if a new characteristic arises that produces an adaptation in this particular environment, so bringing together the ecology and the evolution, we now have the tools from genomics to be able to start asking questions about, well, what are the genes that actually led to that? And so that gives us a more holistic view all the way from the level of the nucleus, essentially, the genotype, all the way ultimately to the perspective of the ecosystem. And it allows us to sort of span those biological scales. I think it's a vision that a lot of people have. It's very difficult to bring those pieces together in any single project, but having the sorts of teams that are developing to address research questions, I think means that sort of this very broad scale understanding is in the not too distant future.
You'll often hear different discussions basically happening at different levels. You can ask, what's the importance of this from an evolutionary perspective, from a biological perspective, from a genetic perspective, and sort of putting those in together to create a holistic narrative is a good goal, I suppose.
Yeah. I think a lot of things are enabling that. And one, just the tools of genomics and stuff, but we also have the tools of AI now coming into play, and methods for integrating data on in ways that, just haven't been possible. And so I think that there are a lot of new opportunities, just in terms of data, maybe we already have, but just for understanding things a little bit better.
Or yeah, I know I have like a plant identifier that uses AI, where you just take a picture and it knows what it is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty smart. Okay, good. Do you have any other comments, hobby horses, things you like to promote?
I mean, I love to promote the herbarium specimens, which is why I brought that up in the question of the climate change. It's, I think, pretty fantastic to think that, specimens that people collected, and it could be herbarium specimens or, fish in jars or stuffed birds or whatever, but our museum collections can give us information on things that, the people who collected them could have never dreamed of. Things collected centuries ago, or providing us with baseline information about species distributions. And they are also, in some cases, providing us with physical samples that can be used to extract DNA. And of course, that's like centuries before DNA was discovered as being the hereditary material, or before they were just collected before anybody knew about genetics, it's like, or evolution. It's like pretty amazing. So I think that I always like to say a good word for the value of natural history collections, even though a lot of people will think, oh, those are just these old things that are over in the corner of a building, particularly as they're becoming digitized and available in a lot of digital formats. They're providing us with amazing data resources for addressing a lot of really important societal questions as well as biological questions.
Okay, that's all my questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks again for the invitation, and yeah, good luck with everything.